whatever it happens to be. My role has been to tell those stories in video format, in radio format on the CKUA radio network, and in blogs online. I got the idea 3 years ago because I was kind of weary of what I was seeing in the media, which was a lot of stories about the really difficult issues of climate change and energy and pollution and all those sorts of things. And I just really felt there was nobody out there making a really serious effort to look at, document, and validate some of the amazing innovation and some of the solutions that are out there. So that was the journey I put down on a piece of paper, and lo and behold, some folks from a couple of big oil companies thought it was a good idea, even though I told them I wouldn't do any stories about fossil fuels or carbon capture and storage. They still agreed to it and have supported this work for the last 3 years, which is really, really amazing and a great privilege for me. We are totally editorially independent. I'm presented by the Pembina Institute, sponsored by Suncor and Shell, but our story ideas are completely our own, so that's how we got started. As of today, we've produced 126 episodes. We've had about 1 million views of our videos and 1 million views of our photos. We are broadcast 3 times on the CKUA radio network a week, and we publish to a whole variety of different conventional and online media sites, such as the Huffington Post or Calgary's Green and things like that. So what I hope to do today is, through telling you some stories, is to definitely confirm that the green energy revolution is underway. If you didn't know it, you do now. And I think one of the best observations I can share with you from the last 3 years is that a lot of these solutions are far more robust than we know, and that the pace of innovation is absolutely stunning. More has changed in the last decade in this area than has changed in the last 100 years. So here are a few quick observations from having produced those 125 stories. And these are in no particular order, but one thing I've learned, and I feel pretty confident saying, is that solar will be a dominant source of energy in the future. There's absolutely no question about that. Wind power is already cheap. More biomass and more biogas just makes sense. I say that because sometimes these energy solutions are even better environmental solutions. Yes, they produce electricity that's clean and green, but sometimes, like in the case of biogas on the farm, the solutions are actually great farm diversification solutions. They're great pollution and environmental solutions. And sometimes they might even be worth more for those reasons than for the energy reasons. Green buildings are becoming and will become the norm, and much faster than anybody anticipated. Batteries will change everything. I know that sounds like a cliche, but we'll talk more about this in the show. The future will be more distributed, more chaotic, more renewable, and much more diverse. There's no question about that. We're already on that road worldwide, and I think we've started taking a few steps in that direction right here in Alberta. So let's start out by talking about one of the most interesting forms of renewable energy, and one that's changed a lot in the last 5 or 10 years, and that's solar energy. I just wanted to pause for a second. I added this slide into my regular presentation just to remind you, if you aren't aware what happened on Sunday, the Alberta government announced their climate change plan, and the 4 key bullets I picked out of that were that coal will be phased out by 2030. That's huge in Alberta because we have about 6 gigawatts of coal. 66% of that coal generation will be replaced by renewable energy, and 33% of all electricity production in the province will be renewable by 2030. These are really big changes, and probably needed changes for Alberta. And the last item, which I don't know what kind of impact it'll have, but $30 carbon tax will be imposed by 2018. And of the folks I've talked to over the last bunch of years who are entrepreneurs in this business say that overall, nothing will do more than leveling the playing field with the carbon tax. So I think there are implications there as well. So what about solar? If we look at Germany, which has the most solar installations in the world right now, and we compare it to Canada, most people think Canada is pretty far north and we don't get a lot of sunshine, but actually Canada gets about 50% or 60% more sunshine than Hamburg, Germany. So in Edmonton, for example, where we are, we get 1,685 sun hours a year as compared to 10,064 in Hamburg, Germany. A lot of Canada, most of populated Canada is pretty good for solar. Southern Alberta is the best in all of Canada for solar, and places like Edmonton are really good for solar. What about snow? This comes up all the time. I did a co-presentation with James Sandercock from NAIT not too long ago. They have put a reference array at different angles on top of NAIT, and they've been doing research on this. And here's what they found. You can see on the right the results of snow cover on the production of the modules. On a lot of the modules, it didn't make any difference at all. And in the modules that are more flat and collected more snow, it made a little more difference. On whole, what Jim has found at NAIT is that, it affected solar production about 5%. So if you go back to our Germany example, we have 50% more solar production here with the same solar module as you would have in Germany, and we lose 5% to snow. So let's start our story about how far solar has come in the unlikely place of Starland County, Alberta, in southern Alberta near Drumheller. This is Bob Sargent. He's a councillor in the county of Starland County, and these guys were determined to get into solar as long ago as 10 years ago. 2005, they put their first solar system in. That's the one you see on the screen right now. This was a monument to engineering and solar. This thing cost $155,000 in 2005. That's a lot of money for 10 kilowatts of solar. That's really a lot of money. These farmers were so determined that they wanted to bring that cost curve down through their own knowledge, through understanding the market, and as a coincidence, the prices of solar were coming down through that same period. So just last year, they installed 10 of these 10 kilowatt systems for about $28,000 to $8,000 each, which is a really, really dramatic improvement. They say that gives them about a 10 to 15 year payback on an energy production system that's guaranteed for 25 years. So why does solar have a sunny future? Well, people want solar. It hardly has any enemies. It's hard to find lobby groups that are holding protests against solar. Unlike most of the other forms of energy, including some of the renewables, solar just does not have a lot of enemies. It's getting cheaper, better, and more cost competitive every year. A week doesn't go by when I read another story about one of the solar companies producing a solar module that's more efficient than their previous one. That has continued year over year for the last number of years. And so a solar module that might have been a couple hundred watts a few years ago is now 260 watts, and some of them are 300 watts, and that's on the same size of solar module as a couple of years ago. Cost competitive, I'll get to that in a minute. That has changed dramatically as well. And solar obviously produces among the lowest emissions of any source of energy. It's nearly zero, and I say nearly zero because you still have to manufacture the solar, and you do produce emissions when you manufacture it. But once it's up on the roof and producing, it's zero emission. The final point about solar that really makes us stand up and pay attention is solar works at small and large scale. Really large scale, it works, and at small scale. And you'll see that the cost differences are not radically different, which is really interesting. So here's why, though, that we're seeing growth in solar around the globe. That's really, really dramatic. Here's why. In 1977, the time of the last oil crisis, solar hardware cost about $77 a watt. So today, that's around 77 cents or less per watt. So it's a 100-time decrease in price since 1977. So today, we're looking at solar you can install for $3 a watt, and that includes everything: the labor, the plans, the permits, and all that sort of thing. Solar is very successful in Germany, Ontario, and the US, and globally right now. This is a really interesting slide that shows the growth of solar. Like so many of these technologies, they have matured within the last decade. Solar, you can see, really just began in 2004 and has just, that curve is really, really dramatic, and that's worldwide solar. So there's 178 gigawatts of solar in the world as of today. And I remember it wasn't too long ago when we talked about 100% increases didn't amount to much. Well, now 100% increase amounts to a lot of energy. Where is solar in the world? Germany, first and foremost. Germany makes the materials. They've installed the materials, and they've done a really good job of it in Germany to the extent that they're now selling their technology all over the world. China came on really quickly and is almost caught up to Germany. And we do see in the US, which I wasn't aware of until about last year, that they really have been working on solar as well. This little sliver of orange you see in there, that's Canada. And the only reason Canada exists in this pie chart at all is because of Ontario. So here's another explanation for the cost of solar PV. So these are annual installations of solar PV like you saw in the previous graph, but it's graphed against the price. So you can see the price, how it's come down over time. And as my colleague James Sandercock at NATE projected, he said we could be seeing prices as low as $1 a watt by 2017. And that is just, that's a total game changer, because it'll be one of the most affordable kinds of energy in the very, very near future. Solar growth in the US, as if to punctuate the point, in Q1 2015, there was 1,300 megawatts of solar installed. That's the size of a pretty good sized power plant. 25% of the residential solar installed in Q1 in the US was installed without any state incentive. More than 51% of all new electric generating capacity in the US has come from solar in that same quarter. Solar jobs in the US, all of these new installations have come with a lot of jobs. One of the highest producing jobs, one of the highest kinds of job producing renewable energies is solar. And in the US, they've created about 174,000 jobs, which is significantly eclipsed the coal jobs in the US. What do some of the companies and the predictors say about the future of solar? This is a scenario done by none other than Shell Canada, and this is one of their scenarios. Some of them have less solar in them, but generally, if you look at projections by futurists, by Bloomberg, by whoever you want to look at, you're going to see a future with a lot more solar. Whether it's as dominant as this graph or not, we're not sure yet, but it's definitely a plausible scenario, even as seen by an oil company. Here's one of the reasons why, and this is a really interesting graph, because what it shows is greenhouse gas emissions and what we would need to do to hold to a 2 degrees Celsius increase in average global temperature. That's the red dotted line. The three other lines are three scenarios, one of which we just looked at from Shell Canada. So what's interesting about this is not so much the fact that we're lagging behind that 2 degrees Celsius line, which we are, and that's definitely worth paying attention to, but the significant fact is that even international oil companies are projecting and understand the need for reducing emissions over time. So you can see all of Shell's scenarios there point to a drop in emissions over time, and that we're in a period of energy transition. So the only issue really is the timing of that transition. Ontario, if we do a quick survey of Canada right now, as I said, the only reason we show up on the international graph of solar is because Ontario has installed 8,000 megawatts of solar, wind, and biomass, or it's underway or installed. 2,300 megawatts of that is solar PV. That compares to a total solar in Alberta of 8 megawatts. So that's 8, one little number 8 compared to 2,356. This was due to the Green Energy Act in Ontario, and Ontario is on the way to having about a third of their capacity renewable literally within the next couple of years. British Columbia, not a place that supports a lot of solar. They've rested on their laurels of having done a lot of big hydro. And although a lot of people worry about new big hydro being very environmentally destructive, legacy hydro tends to get a pass when people talk about emissions and that sort of thing. Once it's established, you do get relatively low emissions energy and or electricity, and that has happened in British Columbia. So they haven't had a lot of emphasis on solar, but this is a really interesting project in Kimberley in southern British Columbia, where they've installed a 1 megawatt sun tracking solar farm on a brownfield. This is the brownfield from the Sullivan mine, which was the largest lead zinc mine in the world. There's enough room in this brownfield for 200 megawatts more of solar. These guys, because this was a new kind of technology, new kind of project, paid a fairly high price of $5.40 a watt. So just keep paying attention to that price per watt, and you'll see that that becomes very relevant as we go on. In Alberta, a place that also has to this day, has no support for solar whatsoever. The Green Acres Hutterite colony in southern Alberta by Bassano installed the largest solar system in Western Canada about 6 months ago. They paid $2.40 a watt. They did that by kicking in a little bit of their own labor, but their quote for this job was $2.80 a watt. So you can see that the price for these big systems is coming down quite dramatically. In this photo, you can't see it all in this photo, but you're looking, this one solar farm represents 25% of all the solar in Alberta today. Another really interesting one-off was Banff created the very first municipal feed-in-tariff. So that's a system of paying for solar energy that gives a slightly elevated rate for that electricity if you put solar on your roof. So Banff did this program. They're just in the middle. They were the first municipality in Canada, and they're just in the middle of executing it right now. So it's of note just because of the leadership, not because of the scale. And then after doing this for 3 years, I had to drop this slide in myself. I have been involved with my own community league right here in Edmonton. So if you're from Edmonton, you're aware of community leagues. We have 158 of them in the city. And just to find out how hard it is to do solar and what the paybacks are and what all the challenges are, I did my own system. So I worked on this as a volunteer for my community league. We installed 13.6 kilowatts of solar for $3.20 a watt. This is a really great community investment because obviously we raised about 3/4 of the money from other sources and put in about 1/4 of our own money. And so our payback on this effectively is very good. So if you think of it as a community investment or a community project, it's one of the very few infrastructure projects you can do that'll actually pay a dividend every month for the next 30 years. So let's pause here for a second. We're going to talk about why solar is relevant. We just talked about the price and why we're seeing such rapid growth in solar in the world today. Now we're going to talk about why solar is such a game changer. So if you guys could type here for a second, I'm looking for the types of solar you see on this house. This is a house in Calgary, Alberta. It was built by Dave Spencer, who's a landscape architect. This is one of the most amazing net zero homes I've seen in Canada. So what kind of solar do we see on this house? So I'm looking for somebody to use their little chat window and take a stab at what the first kind of solar you see in this picture. Seeing none. I don't know if you guys can find where that is, but I'm not sure where it is the first time I've used Zoom. The first kind you'll see is solar PV. So this house has solar PV on the roof, so that produces electricity for this home. Chat is disabled, it says. Ted, I don't know if there's anything you can do to help with that. Anyways, I was able to see that, Ken, so I can see your comment there, just so you know. So the next kind of solar we see in this house, well, if you want to build a net zero house that is super energy efficient and can be powered 100% by solar energy, the next thing that you're going to work on for sure is passive solar design. So a lot of the net zero homes we see have amazing passive solar design. So they try to get as much free energy through the windows and through design that they can, and they often store it in concrete floors, and there's a whole bunch of great strategies for harvesting passive solar energy. So by design, you try to get and hold as much heat and energy as you can without having any technology associated with it, just through good design. The third kind, I didn't even see this when I saw this house, the third kind of solar energy you see built into this house is their solar hot water system, which are those little browny gray panels that have been architecturally designed right into the front of the building. Usually they're big panels you would see on the roof. These are architecturally designed solar hot water modules. And that has led us to the whole idea of net zero homes. So solar and the the reduced price in solar has enabled us to now envision a house that can produce as much energy as it consumes. And as late as 2007, not even 10 years ago, the first 12 net zero homes were built in Canada under a program sponsored by Equilibrium. It was an Equilibrium program sponsored by Enercan, and they put out a bit of money to help 12 different locations in the country build their first net zero homes. And so this was the one built in Edmonton, Alberta. There were 40 architects, engineers, and other folks who worked on this essentially as volunteers to be part of learning about all the technologies you could put in this house. And you can see solar thermal, you can see solar PV. This house is a monument to technology. There's every sustainable technology you could think of in this house, but that leads to us to a problem, or perhaps a challenge. There's nothing wrong with this house. It works exceptionally well, but it was very expensive, and it's also the Starship Enterprise, because there's so much technology in there. If you're going to try to build an idea that's affordable for everyone and changes the game for homes, you need to make the idea a lot simpler. And so home builders, especially in the Edmonton area, latched onto this idea really seriously, starting right then in 2007, and since then have made huge headway in building net zero homes. This is a project of 3 net zero homes in Edmonton. The one in the middle is net zero. The other 2 are net zero ready. They're net zero ready because they don't have energy production systems on them. Otherwise, they're efficient enough, they're well designed enough, they're energy efficient enough that they can be fully net zero homes. So what these guys have done is they built, what they've done is built a very simple design in the house. There's hardly anything in the mechanical rooms. It's a very simple, very efficient design, and that's what's going to make these things affordable for the rest of us. So here's a guy that gets me even more excited about change, and change led on by solar in solar-powered homes. This is Reza Nasseri. He's the CEO of Landmark Homes. They build 800 to 1,000 homes a year here in Alberta. And so, yes, it's really exciting if some rich guys can build some net zero homes that produce as much energy as they consume. But you know, to make a change in the world, what we need are homes that all of us can afford and all of us will buy in the future. Reza Nasseri set out to do this, and he didn't just start this last week. He's been on this journey for about 10 years, and he brought the idea of creating panelized homes from Germany back here, and he built a plant in Edmonton where they churn out 2 homes a day. And the amazing thing about doing it in a plant is they could retain really, really high levels of really high quality design. They can have complete control over the specifications of the home in the factory. But from a business sense, there's also not a lot of waste. That slide you see in the bottom right there, the photo, is the recycle bins in the plant where they build 2 homes a day. It's all computer designed. They hardly waste any material, and if any of you've seen the pile of garbage that sits outside of a house after a house goes up when they're built on site, you'll know that the waste that they produce here is almost nothing compared to that. That also saves money, by the way. So the other thing is these homes are built in an environment that's controlled. You're not using those massive propane heaters for weeks on end when it's -20 outside to build the house. So they also save energy just in the process of building houses. But the whole idea here was to build a house that is far more efficient than homes in the past. So part of their goal was to build the most energy efficient home there is, and they've been working at it for about 10 years. So they added their own spray foam insulation line right in the factory. It's really hard to afford to do that if you try to do that on site, but if you own the system and you have the labor that's in-house, you can do it very affordably, and you can create an incredibly well-sealed home that is potentially a net zero home. So they add air exchange systems, heat recovery drains, all kinds of fancy technology, triple pane windows, energy efficient lights. And then you need one more thing or 2 more things to get to net zero, 2 keys. One is solar, and we know that solar is affordable now. And 2 is this thing called an air source heat pump. So this is a furnace, essentially, for the house. This is a very small mini split air source heat pump that does heat exchange with the air, just like your fridge does, except this uses outside air. And the big game changer, these things now work to -25 and -30. So before, they used to be only rated to -10, which means they're not much use to us in Edmonton, Alberta at 53 degrees latitude. So when you build your net zero home and it's super energy efficient, you only need half the heating system you used to need in a conventional home. So these mini split heating systems systems cost about the same as a conventional furnace in these super efficient homes. So where are they at in this journey to build net zero homes? Well, Landmark wants to build all of their homes net zero ready by 2016. Net zero ready means it's energy efficient enough, it's well designed enough that you simply have to add solar to the roof to make it fully net zero. And so this is a project in Larch Park right here in Edmonton. Those are townhomes that sell for about $460,000. The add-on cost to make these net zero ready from their regular specification of the year before this, say 2013, is only $7,800. So on a $465,000 home, it's $7,800 to add insulation and to add some stuff to make it totally a candidate for net zero. For another $30,000, you add the solar. So for $37,800 on a $465,000 home, you can take care of your energy bill for the next 30 years. So what gets me jazzed about this is that this is getting awfully close to making a lot of sense for the average home buyer. If I were talking to my kids about this, you know, I would say skip the granite countertop, get the net zero ready, and buy the countertop with your savings. So another take on this, Edmonton has really become a hotbed for this stuff, by the way. We have some of the top expertise in building net zero homes and buildings in the world, right here in Edmonton. And we probably have the largest concentration of these net zero homes in Canada. But another step that happened last year that was really important is there was a center built called the Mosaic Center that was a 30,000 square foot building. They used to think it would be really difficult to take these ideas to a commercial building because you don't have enough roof space relative to all the energy you use in office buildings. There's all kinds of challenges that are unique to office spaces versus homes. But this is a 30,000 square foot office building that is net zero. It's solar powered, as you can see right there, and actually they mounted the solar modules flat in this case. That's Vedran Skopak, the architect for this project. It's heated and cooled by a geothermal system or a Geoexchange heating system, which is very similar to the air source heat pump, except that it does heat exchange with the warmth of the earth. This building is also extremely well designed. You can see both sides of the building here. Here I'm standing with Jacob, who's the geothermal designer. You can see the light coming in the far side, and you can see that there's light coming from my left there. It's an extremely well designed building, beautiful building, tons of natural light. There's not a lot of conventional lighting in the building, and all of the workers in there have task lighting. So it's also a beautiful building with a living wall in it, and it's fully net zero. So it will produce as much energy as it consumes over the course of the year. And so it's super energy efficient. And one more feature that I like in office buildings, which has long been my pet peeve, is you can actually open the windows in this office building, which is really nice if you like to get fresh air. So again, the secret to this one is this is the sweet spot for Geoexchange. Geoexchange doesn't make sense for homes because it's so expensive. You'll spend $30,000 putting one of these systems in your home. But at scale, about this scale, or even bigger than this, even at the neighborhood scale, it's a really sweet spot economically for using this kind of system. And the beauty of geothermal, of course, is that in the wintertime, in the summer and the winter, you get heating and cooling from the same system. So you can see how it works. They have the pipes underground. Sometimes they're horizontal, sometimes they're vertical. This is not geothermal, this is Geoexchange. So this is exchanging heat with the earth that's at about 6 degrees Celsius at these depths. In the case of the Mosaic Center, Jacob's standing on the roof where the solar modules are. You can see on the left there, that photo, the trenches where the Geoexchange system went in the early stages of construction. It's now under that parking lot behind Jacob's arm. So I'm going to tell you one more story, and this is more relevant. This is one of my older stories that I told a number of years ago, but this is more relevant today, especially with Sunday's announcement. This is Dan Balaban, who I call a wind energy cowboy. This guy has built fully about 1/3 of Alberta's wind power in 2 projects. He just started this company a number of years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, 7 years ago, and he went from being a software engineer for an oil company and decided he wanted to get into the renewable energy business. Well, this one guy has built 1/3 of our wind industry in Alberta in that short period of time. And he did that through a couple of amazing things. One, that his business plan was, I'm not going to go fight for space in the Pincher Creek area where everybody's fighting over leased land, and frankly what is almost too much wind. You don't need all the wind that comes through Pincher Creek, and often the turbines that are installed down there actually have to put the brakes on so they can resist when there's too much wind. So what Dan did was he followed the wind out onto the prairies, and he followed the transmission lines to keep his costs really low, and he started to harvest. You've heard the term unconventional oil. Well, he's harvesting unconventional wind. So he's using low wind applications, and way out in the prairies, as far north as Red Deer and as far east as Saskatchewan, you can build these projects very economically. What Dan did that's different from all the wind developers you may have heard about in Ontario is it's really hard being in the wind business in Alberta. There wasn't a lot of support for it, and so you basically have to survive on your own wits. And what Dan did as a businessman was he drew really big circles. He engaged all the residents that were inside the circles where his wind farms are going to be built, and wound up with almost no protesters. There's almost no conflict in the projects he's built, one north of Lethbridge and one by Halkirk near Red Deer, Alberta. The other thing that's notable about guys like Dan is he's in the wind business. This is not an afterthought to him. It's not another kind of energy business dabbling in the wind business. He needs to put supper on his table. He needs to be successful in the wind business, and in my mind, that's really important. You want to harness all of the enthusiasm that entrepreneurs have if you really want to get this stuff right. The last piece that's extremely important, what made these two projects viable in Alberta, was that Dan sold renewable energy credits to California. And that's what made them economic, and that's the reason that he didn't build 6 more projects that he had developed. 1 gigawatt more of wind, which you can see on that map there, is because the economics weren't quite there. So, thinking about the announcement on the weekend about what Alberta is doing for the future, here's the stats on Black Spring Ridge. Black Spring Ridge was actually supported by the Climate Change Emissions Management Corporation, which is those are the guys that get the so-called carbon tax money that large industry has paid in the past for large emitters for their carbon dioxide. When they're over 100,000 tons a year, they pay into this fund. And this fund has been investing in a lot of different technologies, from CCS to research and to renewable energy and a variety of things. And what this slide shows you is a whole bunch of really interesting points. One of Dan's projects was a 300 megawatt wind project, the Black Spring Ridge project. It's a $600 million project. The CCMC invested only $10 million in that project. And you can see on right there, on that little graphic on the right there, explains the whole investment of the CCMC in renewable energy. And you can see that they've invested $46,000 in renewable energy and take credit for helping get $688 million worth of projects going. But bear in mind, almost all of that is this one project. This one project also is responsible for 4.2 million tons of greenhouse gas reductions, about 40% of all the greenhouse gas reductions that CCMC's managed to gather. So if you think about it, 10 million gets you 40% of all your emissions reductions. It's probably the best performance per dollar invested if you want to reduce your emissions. And that the graph in the bottom left explains why that's such a big challenge in Alberta. You can see that Alberta is responsible essentially for Canada's rising greenhouse gas emissions, and we are singularly the most important factor in that, which is why we've had such a difficult time in the international arena. Ontario, on the other hand, phased out 6 gigawatts of coal and added almost as much or more renewable energy already, hence their graph is going to the left pretty significantly, which means they've actually contributed to bringing down emissions in Canada. Alberta, with Sunday's announcement, is going to take a whack out of that graph, and that's why it was such a game changer. I'm going to tell you a couple of more stories that just show the potential of some of these new green technologies and what's been happening behind the scenes that you may not be aware of. This is a really fascinating project in Chatham, Ontario, and I call this industrial symbiosis. This is an ethanol plant. Now, personally, I'm not super keen about ethanol because it takes food and produces gas from it. But if you're going to do ethanol, this is quite a remarkable project. So this plant in Chatham, Ontario buys 20 million bushels of corn from farmers that are right in their neck of the woods, right in their neighborhood near Chatham in southern Ontario. They produce 100 million liters of ethanol with that corn. They also produce, as a byproduct, once you take the ethanol out of the corn, you still have 140,000 tons of grain left over that is actually a cattle feed. So the same farmers come back and buy that 140,000 tons of grain and feed it to their cows. This plant produces about 100,000 tons of CO2, and about 80% of that is used by an on-site Prax air plant that harvests that CO2 and uses it in their operations. This plant also produces about 3,000 to 4,000 tons of corn oil as a little side product. But what makes this project really important is they are using most of their waste except one. So there's still a smokestack at this plant that's putting out a lot of heat and still about 20% more CO2. So this guy, Greg DeVries, who is a greenhouse farmer in southern Ontario, got the idea of what if we build greenhouses right across the road from the ethanol plant. And so that's exactly what they've done. And they are going to build 60 acres of greenhouse. To get a sense for how big that is, this is one of the 20-acre greenhouses. And if you ran the 400-meter dash straight from where Greg is standing there going in the other direction, you could run the whole 400-meter dash in a straight line inside this greenhouse of tomatoes. It's a really, really big greenhouse. You could not afford to heat this greenhouse if you had to use conventional fuels. But where Greg's going to get half of his heat from is from the smokestack across the road. They're essentially sending all of the heat from that smokestack in a pipe under the road to the greenhouse, and also they're going to harvest some of the remaining CO2 that's coming out of that stack, which they anticipate by maintaining elevated rates of CO2 in the tomato greenhouse, they'll be able to increase production by 3 to 5% from the CO2 alone. So they're going to grow 22 acres of tomatoes inside this greenhouse, and they have 2 more planned right across the road from the ethanol plant. So, you know, as Greg told me, he said, I don't drive by smokestacks and think about it the same way as I used to. Here's another one. This is particularly relevant to Alberta if you have a bigger view to this and you're not just about the big numbers of producing energy. There's also a lot of really smaller solutions that, as I alluded to in my introduction, provide really interesting benefits. This is James Callahan. He's a 5th-generation farmer in Lindsay, Ontario, north of Toronto. And he got the idea of installing a biogas plant in his cattle operation. He has a cattle operation of 250 dairy cows, and he farms about a section of land as well, so he has cash crops. And so what he did was he installed rakes in his barn, and you can see just the tip of it in the lower right there. There's a big automatic rake that basically slowly moves across the bottom of the barn and gathers up all the manure and sends it over to this digester, where he also adds some other wastes like French fry molasses, donuts, and cow manure, because some of those other things actually enhance the methane production or natural gas production from the methane. That big balloon roof on the building expands and contracts with how much methane is being produced in the digester. So it's essentially cow poo in there, and it's producing natural gas, and the natural gas fires the power plant, which is right next to it, which is in this other photo. That's a 500 kilowatt power plant that produces electricity 24/7 on the farm. So now James has a diversified income. So he's producing electricity 24/7, and he gets paid via a contract in Ontario. Thanks to their Green Energy Act, he gets paid about 16 cents a kilowatt hour for that electricity, which he pumps out about 250 kilowatts constantly 24/7. The neat thing about this kind of electricity as a renewable source is it is dispatchable. You can save up the gas and you could produce electricity at certain times. It's not how this plant operates, but it's you definitely could do that. It also produces local electricity out in the middle of nowhere where his farm is, so it helps make the grid more robust. And it dramatically reduces greenhouse gas emissions. If he had spread that manure in the field, it would be released as methane and would be, whatever the number is, 25 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. So he's preventing the greenhouse gases, and he's solving his own runoff issues and pollution issues and odor issues that also happen if you spread that manure in the field. He still gets to spread the manure, by the way, after it's processed, but it doesn't have as many of those bad qualities that cause the runoff issues or the odor issues. About 26 of these projects were built in Ontario. and a bunch were left on the shelf when they ended the program. I talked to some folks in Alberta who understand this business, and they say there's room for about 100 biogas operations of 0.5 to 1 megawatt in Alberta, should we be interested in farm diversification and energy production at the same time. Germany has about 5,000 of those digesters. Ontario has 28, and Alberta has 2, and one in Vegreville and one in Lethbridge. So, and one more example that I love, I'm a forester by education. I studied forestry in university, and never worked a day because I've worked as a reporter and a writer and a publisher ever since. But this is the Alpac plant. This is the biggest craft pulp mill in North America. And I didn't know this about it, but if you build a big monster of a pulp mill like this in the middle of nowhere, you do have a problem because you need a lot of electricity. And so it turns out right in the design of these pulp mills, they designed in 2 high-pressure steam units that produce electricity using 2 sources of fuel. One is 450,000 tons of waste that comes out, that is available at this pulp mill. They can't throw everything into the vats that make the pulp, the bark, and there's all kinds of other pieces that don't work. So they go into a waste pile. That waste now becomes a fuel, a biomass fuel, that's burned in about a 10, I think it was a 15-story, 10 or 15-story boiler, the biggest boiler I've ever seen in my life. They have a second boiler, and it runs on the black liquor. So this is a chemical pulp plant, and they use something called white liquor. It's the chemicals that separate the wood and turn it into pulp. It turns black. It's called black liquor. It turns out it's a really good fuel, which fuels the boilers that produce electricity for the plant. So this plant has 2 40-megawatt power plants built right into it. They uses their own waste to produce their own electricity. But a number of years ago, they made a change by adding another generator, which was designed to export electricity to the grid. And so they added a 32 megawatt generator that works off of the waste of the other 2 generators and produces more electricity that's actually sent out to the grid. This plant, though, interestingly not producing 24/7 like the biogas generator we just saw on the farm. This is used as a peaking power plant. So traditionally, peaking power plants are things like natural gas plants. They can be fired up relatively quickly. So in order to be a peaking plant, you have to be able to fire up your plant to full production within 15 minutes, or you don't get the high prices that you get for being a peaking power plant. And that's because we need those plants to solve problems when we have sudden increases in demand, that sort of thing. So this biomass power plant is actually a peaking power plant. It makes all its money by operating about 22 days of the year. Getting closer to the another interesting story. This is a really small scale. This is not going to solve our fuel problems worldwide, but I love the story because it's about the level of enthusiasm that I found across Canada for a whole variety of solutions that are much greener. These guys, the Cowichan Biodiesel Co-op, were gathering French fry oil and things like that and turning it into biodiesel and selling it in 4-liter containers at the farmers market for years because it was kind of their pet thing. They all drove little TDI diesels and then filled them up with their own biodiesel that they made until they struck gold. They latched on to all of the cooking oil and the waste oil, food oils from cruise liners that land at Ogden Point in Victoria. And that's a lot of oil, as it turns out. And so they actually had to make a refinery to deal with that oil. And they did that at the Cowichan Biodiesel biofuel facility, which is at the Duncan landfill, as it turns out. And they now refine all of the waste oil from all of the cruise liners that land in Victoria, which is quite a few. And they take that and they refine it. And guess what? They power the buses on the same dock that take the same tourists who are eating the French fries on the cruise liner. They power these buses by B100, which means 100% diesel fuel. You can see it right on the side of the bus there. So the buses that take the tourists around are running on French fry oil, essentially, from the cruise liners. So a great little sustainable fuels loop. This is what you can do at a small scale, and you know, it's a pretty neat story. So they also did, because they had other keeners in Duncan, British Columbia, they set up a card lock. So they actually sell their biodiesel via a card lock in Duncan as well. So the last series of stories I'm going to tell you here is, how's our time? Almost, I'm going to have to wrap up pretty quick. So I'm going to tell you about electric cars, and this is an area that everybody's curious about, and it's really underdeveloped so far. I'm going to do that through a story about a guy who started a company called Sun Country Highway. Kent Rathwell moved from Toronto to Langham, Saskatchewan. Saskatoon actually is where he lives, but his business is in Langham, Saskatchewan. He bought a company called Sun Country Farms, and this whole story about electric vehicle charging stations starts with him selling birdseed out of Saskatoon. It turns out that birdseed is a really big business. As you can see from Doug Anderson, who's on the left there at PV Mart, he's the CEO of PV Mart. That whole aisle that he's standing in are all products made by Kent Rathwell and Sun Country Farms. And so when Kent got the idea of starting a second company, he got this crazy idea that he wanted to form a zero-emission company in Saskatchewan. He wanted to have he wanted to address the whole value chain and try to make it carbon-free. Turns out that was a pretty audacious thing to try. Initially, he worked on green energy projects in Saskatchewan and had some success, but then decided where he could make a contribution would be to create electric vehicle charging stations in Canada, because obviously you're not going to see electric cars unless we have the electric vehicle charging stations. So this is exactly what they tell you not to do in business school. Don't try to lead the market. Try to sell people things they need, like food and necessities, clothing, but don't try to lead the market. And he was way out in front of this market. He went out, he took his own money, he had level 2 chargers designed, really high quality ones, and he went out to sell his chargers. Well, was he successful? Yes, because he talked PV Mart, his friend Doug Anderson, into putting one at the front doors of every single PV Mart in Western Canada, where you can charge for free. They're now at Best Western Hotels, IKEAs, and about 2,200 other locations across Canada and North America. So one guy with a crazy idea has created the longest connected chain of vehicle charging stations in the world, in Canada. And if you don't think that's exciting, consider that in Alberta, we may have as few as 200 or 300 electric vehicles as of this day, because we've never had programs. Most of the electric vehicles in Canada are in BC, Ontario, and Quebec. So that's Kent outside of a PV Mart charging for free. So it turns out maybe Kent wasn't crazy, because some projections I've read recently are that there's going to be 11.4 million electric vehicle charging stations in operation worldwide by 2020. So that's not very far down the road. So electric cars, I think I'm going to wrap up here pretty quick. Suffice to say, like solar, the growth curves just started, in this case by 2011, but they're just as steep as solar, and they're coming on really fast, even though we don't see it much in Alberta. The exciting part for me about cars is not just about fuel switching and changing how we power our cars, it's about the potential role of these cars in the grid. One of the things we need to help take on a lot more renewable energy is energy storage. And if we could get individuals, private individuals, to pay for the biggest battery system money can buy by just buying them in their cars, that could, in the future, be an extremely robust solution for our grid. And how you would use that is you would pay car owners to sell their energy back to the grid at times of high demand, and you would charge them less at times when you have excess energy on the grid, and that's when they charge their cars. This is pretty easy to do because cars sit doing nothing about 95% of the time, either at your office or at your home. So I'm just going to skip over these. Turns out EVs are already lower emissions than, have lower emissions in the US by half compared to conventional vehicles, even if you consider all the different sources of electricity, including coal-fired power plants. What is the top selling EV in Canada? I'm going to skip through this. So is it the Tesla, the Chevy Volt, the Smart EV, or the Nissan Leaf? It is the Chevy Volt. And it's really because the Chevy Volt is kind of a hybrid. You can get 600 kilometer range out of it, and that's probably one of the reasons that it's so successful. Interesting though, Tesla's Model S, which sells for more than $100,000, has almost more than half as many sales as those Chevy Volts, which sell at about $45,000. The best non-electric car on the market, this is my wife's, it's not exactly her car, but she has the same one. This is the Prius C, which has a real-world mileage rating of about 66 miles per gallon. So I'm at the end. What is the cheapest source of electricity? If our commenting function worked, we could do this, but I'm just going to have to tell you. The cheapest source of electricity, according to all the electricity we purchased in 2013 on the Alberta grid, this is based on actual purchases, was wind power. So wind power in 2013, on average, we paid 5.5 cents a kilowatt hour for wind power, 7.7 cents for coal, 8.3 cents for gas, and so on. This is way more complicated than it seems. I'm simply making the point that wind energy can produce energy very cheaply, and this is way more complicated though than meets the eye, because some of these fuel sources are used for certain jobs on the grid, such as peaking power plants, that sort of thing, and their prices are naturally going to be high, and we're going to want to pay higher prices for those because they help make our grid more robust. So it's a more complicated story than it would seem. Suffice to say that renewable energy is coming on, and the price is fast getting competitive all over the world, and even here in Alberta. So I'm just going to end right there.
Well, I guess with that ending, David, I would open the floor to questions via the chat window or the Q&A function.
I have a quick question for you, David, but thank you very much. It was an inspiring, fast-paced, inspiring delivery you've got there. All kinds of interesting, creative stories that you've shared in technologies. Thank you. Let's say, and I've learned so much in the last 45 minutes. Let's say I wanted to share something with people who don't know that much. Where could I go to buy what, to do what? You know, the cheapest, you know, best bang for your buck, and to, you know, the most effective use of, let's say, a solar panel. You know, Canadian Tire, Home Depot, Lowe's, whatever, and to plug what into.
You know, when it comes to, you can still hear me, right, Ted? Just nod. Yeah, thank you. It's just good to know I'm not speaking into the ether. Yeah, you're right, Maurice. You know, one of the things is that the price of these things is as much dependent on your own knowledge as it is the marketplace. And these are early days for a lot of these technologies. So I really urge you to educate yourself about this. If you're interested in solar, first educate yourself. We have 125 videos online that often talk about price and things to look out for at greenenergyfutures.ca. So I would definitely start there. If you're interested in net zero homes, if you're interested in solar, geothermal, whatever it happens to be, start there. But then get some really good advice, because as you saw, that even when some municipalities do solar projects, they can wind up paying a lot more than other ones. And I can tell you in Starland County, when they paid $155,000 for a 10 kilowatt solar system, they were determined to be leaders in price after that, and they are. So they've actually helped bring down the price of solar just by their own knowledge levels and adding a bit of DIY. So get some good advice. A lot of these technologies are pretty good, but you need some good advice in order to implement them. And the best example I can give you is you look at my slide about solar, passive solar energy and how important it is, and you think, well, I'll just go out and buy one of those Lindor homes, you know, the ones that looks like a cabin with all the windows on the front, and I'll face it south. Well, the only problem with that is that on a summer day, your living room will be about 47 degrees Celsius, and I guarantee you're not going to be sitting there, especially if it's facing south. It's not rocket science in this stuff, but it is science, and so it really pays to get some good advice.
There's a question that's come in, David. What is the best way to find leading environmental building designers in Alberta?
Well, I guess it depends on what you're trying to build, but here in Edmonton, we have some of the leading firms in Canada. So if you want a custom builder for a home, we have a whole slew of them. Peter Amarangan, who has Habitat Studios, is one of the grand pappies of net zero design here. He was the guy who led that project in the Riverdale project, but he and there's another half a dozen, maybe even 10 custom builders that are high quality, Effect Homes. I'm trying to think of the names off the top of my head. There are architects in town that do the bigger projects. So the Mosaic Center was built by Manask Isaac, which is they're real leaders in this kind of technology. And of course, through the process of doing that building, they brought Shando's Construction along for the ride. And so we're rapidly educating builders and trades and other builders in this stuff. But yeah, get some references and find somebody you trust and get some good advice, because it can be done really, really well. And you know, in the past, things like geothermal, for example, were done shoddily, and it gives the whole geothermal industry a bad name. If you get somebody good and you understand the price, educate yourself first so you don't get hosed when it comes to the price as well.
I guess I'd pose a question on behalf of sort of on behalf of sort of a government kind of twist on this, David. If you had kind of a green bucket list for the next year for governments in Alberta, what would your top 3 things be that you'd like government in Alberta to consider?
Well, you know, from what I know about all this technology, Ted, the biggest step's already been taken, and was taken last Sunday with the announcement of the Alberta government. So now the hard work comes. They need to sit down and figure out how to do this really well. And so I would urge them that to think about what our objectives are. And, you know, I think for me, decisions about what to invest in would be based on a number of objectives. One is developing new jobs and new businesses. That's definitely one, and green energy is great for that. Just working on a story on that right now, as it turns out. 2 is greenhouse gas emissions. If you're trying to reduce emissions, and we have the biggest problem in Canada, then you want to be strategic about your investments, and that was my point about that wind investment. Huge bang for your buck. If you actually want to reduce emissions, wind power gives you like an amazing bang for your buck. But then there's another story there too. You could just go out and build a lot of big wind farms and check, you've got some renewable energy. But I don't think that'll harness the potential of individuals and entrepreneurs in Alberta who want to be part of this. And so I also think they need a pretty comprehensive strategy for distributed renewable energy. They need to do community programs to harness the energy of cities like Edmonton and Medicine Hat and other places that are already really creative on these files. Edmonton recently put an aspiration on the table of building 70 megawatts of solar energy in the city. And with that kind of aspiration and the province's new goals of renewable energy, if you match those two, the beauty of that is that's going to engage citizens in Edmonton. It's going to let us all participate in this energy revolution, and it's going to result in a lot of local jobs. So I think those are some of the deliverables I'd look for.
Okay, and I guess I'd open it up to our webinar participants to post any questions you'd like David to consider.
And hello, Ellen, by the way.
David, it's Wendy Oppers here. First of all, thanks for posting Heidi Igel and her horse in your final slide. I visited Heidi on her farm outside of Pincher Creek, and that's the Summer View Wind Farm. That's quite impressive that she lives next to and is quite proud of. My question to you is, do you have any examples of in-vessel sewage composting and capturing the heat from that into energy sources? So the town of Okotoks did in-vessel sewage composting for their wastewater, and that produces a lot of heat, similar to your biogas kind of idea with the cows.
Right, and so in Vancouver, this is an interesting story actually. I don't understand the in-vessel part. You'll have to explain that to me. But as far as harvesting heat out of the sewer system using heat exchange, in the Olympic Village in Vancouver, they have such a system, and we actually have a story on that back in our archives somewhere. It's amazing. I actually went down in the sewer system. I didn't know when I did this job that I'd be spending so much time with poo. But anyways, I got to go down in the sewer system in Vancouver and see how that system operates. And it turns out that actually Edmonton is looking at that technology right now as one of the methods of producing heat energy in its Blatchford project. And the idea there is to build a 100% renewable community for 30,000 people in Edmonton. I'm still skeptical as to whether we'll pull it off, but if we do, it'll definitely be a world-class project. So they're going to get their energy from a couple of places. Obviously, it'll be a solar-ready community. That's where they get a lot of their electricity. But the design of the neighborhood is such that they're planning to use Geoexchange, a district Geoexchange system. So the same heating system that I showed you in the Mosaic Center is being applied at the neighborhood level there. And so that'll be very interesting to watch that. And the second thing they want to try is heat exchange with the sewer system. And I'm sorry, I don't understand what the in-vessel part of your question was.
Okay, so in-vessel, just really quickly, you take your sewage, you dewater it, you then ship it into a system of, like, basically looks like a storage container. You add wood chips to it and, you know, seal it up and monitor it and everything else. And the high heat exchange of that then produces a Class A compost out of basic, you know, municipal sewage. So that can be used for mostly reclamation kinds of purposes, but it produces a lot of heat in the process of turning that sewage into a compost. And I think that could be used in a similar biogas exchange to even heat the buildings associated with wastewater, if not, you know, sent to other local buildings.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And you know, one of the byproducts of a lot of the ways we produce energy, not just renewable ways, is heat. And utilizing that heat is the simplest, easiest way to make all of these systems far more efficient. And that's where you started to get the idea of cogeneration, even in natural gas plants. But the other thing I was going to say is about compost. Edmonton has, of course, the giant composter. So we have probably the biggest composter anywhere in the world in our waste management stream. But the other thing about compost garbage is that it is really high energy. I was really surprised to learn this because I visited a larger biogas operation like the farmer system that we talked about earlier. In Vegreville, Alberta, there's a system that's quite a bit bigger than that. I think it's about 5 times or 6 times bigger than that. And they actually use cow manure as their main raw material to produce methane, the gas that runs the generators. But they also use garbage. So they're taking the municipal organic waste from places like the Duke. And why? It actually produces more energy than the cow manure, which I was very surprised to learn. And in a lot of these cases, it also produces heat. So James, he's just a farmer. His system wasn't designed to harvest the heat, but he did anyways, because that's what farmers do. And he was cycling that heat over to heat his buildings and stuff, some of the waste heat from his generator.
I guess what I do is pose another opportunity for folks to pose questions. But in the meantime, while people are thinking about that, David, from a residential kind of perspective, what sort of top 3 things would you recommend to people to consider, top 3 things that have sort of quick payback from a residential perspective?
Oh, that's such a hard question because it really depends on where you're at in your life. So if it's my kids, I would really seriously tell them to look at net zero housing, because 30 years from now, when energy prices have gone through the roof and carbon taxes are high, they're going to be all smiles. And as I said before, they may eventually be able to afford that granite countertop if that's what you're really into. As far as in a regular home, I mean, energy efficiency is always your best bet. It's unsexy, it's unexciting, it's not as cool as solar, but you know, it's always the best bang for your buck. And it's get some advice on that. You know, we did an audit. We had some audits done. We did a story on it. And the auditors that do these home audits and stuff these days are amazing. They'll actually give you a recipe of all the things you can do to make your home more energy efficient because they're so good at this now. They'll say, well, you have X amount of insulation, and if you add a certain amount, you'll get this kind of payback. If you replace your windows, you get this kind of payback. And honestly, that's the best thing you can do. That $500 or $1,000 or whatever it costs you to get that audit done is the best thing you can do if you want bang for your buck. If you just want new windows, that's probably the worst investment in terms of payback. But if you want new windows and it's of high value to you aesthetically, great, invest in new windows, but at least do it as triple pane windows. But windows, again, are going to be 35-year payback or something like that. Whereas insulation, light bulbs, thermostats, there's a whole range of things that can make your system more efficient and have much shorter payback.
Well, thanks so much for that, David. What I'd like to do now is conclude the session here. Thanks so much for a really informative presentation. And just a bit of a plug for you in terms of where can folks find more David Dodge Green Energy Futures information?
Well, we're at greenenergyfutures.ca, and as we said before, we've produced about 125 videos from across Canada. They're all There's one called Net Zero 101 if you're really interested in learning more about how these net zero homes work, and that's something I'm fascinated with. And it turns out the audience is too. It's one of our #1 rated topics is net zero homes. People really are curious about how to make a more resilient, robust home that's going to cost them a lot less to operate.
Well, excellent, David. Thanks so much. I guess in conclusion, I would introduce next week's session is by Dr. Chris Reagan, who is the chair of the Eco-Fiscal Commission of Canada. And he actually consulted and advised a different David Dodge, who was the governor of the Bank of Canada, David. And he is now a professor of economics at McGill University, and he authored apparently the most used economics textbook in Canada. So next Wednesday over the lunch hour, Dr. Chris Reagan from McGill University is presenting. And just in closing, I'd like to mention our co-partner here that I neglected to mention in the introduction is the Municipal Climate Change Action Center, who is posting all of the presentations to their YouTube channel. And this presentation will be posted there as well. So again, thanks so much to everyone for joining us. It was a fascinating presentation, and I think people will be using Google and using the keywords green energy futures.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity, Ted.
Thanks so much for presenting. Anyways, thanks for tuning in.
Bye.
Bye now.